Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HR Dialogues. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman. Today, we will be discussing coaching with Glenn Wallace, and I look forward to explore the current state of coaching and what we can expect in the future as we try to roll out broader, scalable people initiatives. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Glenn, it's really great to have you in our conversation today.
Dieter, lovely to see you again, and thanks very much for having me on.
Glenn, for the listeners, just give us a little bit around yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And then what are we going to talk about today?
In brief, I run a company called Exigence, and that's a company that works with organizations that are going through transformation and change and using coaching interventions of all sorts of different varieties to help embed that change, ensure that the growth is heading in the direction that it wants to go. So that's my kind of day job. I've been a coach, an executive coach for 22 years now, which is amazing. Feels like, about 3 or 4 years if I really think about it. And I apparently one of the few people in the world with both a master's degree and a doctorate in coaching. So, it means I know an awful lot about a very little thing.
I love that description. Glenn, I think to kickstart us from my side, I think we can all acknowledge, and as you've already mentioned, that coaching has become an essential part of any executive or leadership program. In my experience, very much, coaching has to complement that personal journey that the leader needs to go through. I think we've seen that expand a lot more into the team space, with team coaching becoming very, very popular over the last couple of years. But I think the one question that people have always asked, and that's something I would love to explore with you today, is how do I scale coaching so that people have got access to good quality coaches at all levels of the organization? But to get us started, let's get onto the same page. If I ask you the question, what is coaching? What would you tell me?
So it's a really good question. And actually, I think it's pivotal to perhaps much of the rest of the conversation, because one of the challenges that coaching faces, I think, is that there is no single definition. Nobody owns the definition of coaching. For me, it's about a flexible, individualized approach that helps an individual develop or achieve goals. I think it's as kind of broad as that for me. You'll hear coaching bodies and academic places try and sort of suggest that there is a single or a received wisdom kind of version of coaching. I don't believe that to be true, and that's both helpful in one sense and really unhelpful in another. I think it's really unhelpful for buyers of coaching. To really understand what it is. But I think if we focus on, it's an individualized approach typically, even when you're in a group, it's the individual that's under focus and is the person that's being supported. You meet them where they are, and there's either development, change, or goal attainment that comes out the back end of a really high quality coaching conversation.
I love that definition also around talking about that, it's about movement and it's about progress and it's about shifting people towards the future. I think also by grounding the individual in, why am I here? Who am I? And what's the best way that I can do this? I'm always a bit skeptical when I find these mass market approaches to say, take me through this process and then you will achieve this type of goal, where I think there is a lot more to it around understanding who the human being and the individual is on the other side, and their personal wants and needs. And I think the path for every single one looks slightly different. Glenn, take us back a couple of years. I do want to, in the context of the coaching conversation, because as you've mentioned, I think there's a lot of different interpretations for what coaching is. Give us a very practical idea of how do you engage in an organization. So I contact you, I say, Glenn, we're in need for a coach for our executive team. How do we go about that?
Yeah, I think that's quite a common sort of conversation to have. And I think if that's helpful for listeners to sort of think how they might play that through effectively, that's a useful place to start. I think the first thing is that I would say back to you as the person making that inquiry, tell me exactly what it is that you think that you as the organization want this person to be doing that they're not doing currently. So where's the gap between, where they are now and where you want them to be? And what does that end state look like? Give me a really good, clear picture of that. And I'll be really honest and say that actually really busy HR leaders, or whether you're the COO looking to bring in some coaching, or whoever the buyer is, often so busy that we almost have to coach them through the process to work out for themselves what it is they really want. And so I think that is the first piece for me. Be really clear on what impact you want. And the second one is to understand what's gone on already. What support and development has that person had thus far, and what difference did it make, if any? And if not, this is where you can have some really interesting conversations. If not, why not? And I think that's some very fertile ground. And then it's really about the expectations in terms of, okay, what do you think coaching's going to be able to do? And then we'll agree whether it's something that we can help you with or not. I think it's really important, by the way, coming back to our initial point, is there are probably too many coaches, and I was certainly one in my early days, who will take any coaching assignment, assuming that because I can coach one person, I can coach them all. And I think good coaches, or more experienced coaches over time, know that they're better at some contexts than others. And in many ways, you're helping an organization more by saying that that's really not my bag, or that's not my area of expertise.
And I think that contracting conversation is quite an important one. But what I love about what you're saying is that self-awareness also as the coach to understand, we know you're not the right fit. I've been in a couple of situations where, upon engaging with a potential client, I've just realized, I am not going to be the person that's going to be able to guide you here. And I know some people call it chemistry. I think it goes broader than that. I think there's context, which you also refer to. And within that particular context, what is the goal and what is the objective and what's the best type of support that this individual would require and would need. Something else, Glenn, that triggered when you mentioned understand what's already happened up to now. And I think that's a trick that a lot of people miss. They come in without taking into account there's a history here and there's things that's led us towards this particular point. And whether those reasons are right or wrong, they are there and they do exist. And whether they've been expressed or not, it doesn't really matter. I think it is just taking the time to really get an understanding of, what is the story up to now and what is that next chapter going to look like when we do engage with the client.
I think it's vital, because without it, you could make lots of assumptions around what's happened or what's not happened. You could be going over old ground unnecessarily, and actually you might be taking an approach that didn't work previously. So why do you think just because you're doing it, it's going to work this time? So I think there's definitely some of that. One thing I probably should add is, it sort of linked to that point, Dieter, is how ready is the person to start to work on the changes that the organisation, is keen for them, or they themselves are pushing for. It doesn't matter which side that drive is coming from, but actually, how ready are they to start the work?
And I think something you and I've spoken about before is in that context, the evidence-based coaching that you apply towards that particular process. So yes, it is about readiness, but it's also about what is the context of various data sources telling me about that and how do I manage that from a confidentiality point of view. And Glenn, I want to ask you the question because I think the world that we live in has changed quite a lot over the last couple of years. We can all acknowledge that. So how has that impacted and what are some of the challenges that you've seen in the coaching space today versus, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, I think there are both challenges for coaches and challenges for organisations. So if we just focus on some of the challenges for coaches, I think is in that first 6 months, 8 months of sort of lockdown back in 2020, there was understandably such a high level of uncertainty that organisations kind of just went, we're just pressing pause and we're just going to throw all the effort we can into supporting people. And most organisations, I think, certainly those that I'm aware of, did a really good job of being present, being helpful, supporting people and putting a metaphorical arm around people. The challenge for coaches at that point was, well, the kind of work's dried up. And yet you and I were having this conversation offline, actually it's in times of real challenge, whether that's economic challenge or like the COVID situation, that's when people need more help, not less. But the temptations for organizations is to sort of retract back into themselves and sort of try and wait it out. And I would argue, and this is not a sales pitch for coaching or anything else, it's just thinking about your people and the employee value proposition. When they need you most, are you stepping into that or are you stepping back from it? And I think that's something just that organizations might want to have a think about. The other thing that happened for coaches over a period was, as people started to come back to the office, team coaching really took off. I mean, the amount of team coaching that went on as people, and team coaching, for those that aren't really aware, it's definitely not a team away day. It's not bonding. It's not team. All of those things kind of in there. But team coaching is a very prescriptive, modelled intervention, usually over 6 months or a year, to get a team from where it is now to where it needs to be in order to deliver strategic imperatives. And what we found was there was a lot of team coaching going on in that period as people returned to work. So there have been some real challenges. Coaches such as myself, who've been doing coaching quite a long time, had already started to do some work using Zoom or Teams or on the phone. Interestingly, it's different. It's a different experience for both parties. Still seems to be super effective, despite one's let's say, not everybody's, my reservations maybe about how effective it was going to be. What might you lose in terms of the subtlety when you're coaching somebody through Zoom or Teams? So there was that kind of shift too that coaches had to make. Organizations, as we've hinted at, trying to work out what's the best way of supporting people who are going through, the changes that COVID have thrown up. So I think in the last couple of years, it's not been easy for both sides. And yet there have been some real success stories. And I think one of that sort of area of key success is some innovation in the space. That means we've moved away from a very old industrial model, really, of coaching, which is coach the very top of an organization and everybody else will benefit because these people are now kind of superhuman. And you kind of go, well, I'm not quite sure that's exactly how it works.
And I think there's Glenn, a lot of good points that you've made there. And the first one for me was really around the fact that I think organizations should guard against making reactive knee-jerk decisions just based on current context. We've just come out of the pandemic. We're probably moving into a looming recession at the moment, depending on, who you follow. And I think there would be that notion to say, but let's cut costs on certain elements. And what I sometimes worry about is I think coaching is viewed in isolation. It's not viewed in the context of a broader process with other factors also playing into it. So I think that is going to guide decision-making quite a bit within organizations. I love the fact that coaching has also innovated because I agree. Myself also as a psychologist, I was very kind of skeptical about doing big team sessions, not in the coaching context, but, team effectiveness and those types of things across a digital landscape. And I think it's proven to us that this is possible, but it is different because that's also an important thing to remember. It's not a plug and play. You really have to think differently around how the engagement works and the interaction works as part of those elements. Glenn, I want to dive into your last point that you've made around moving away from, the industrialized model of coaching, because that's also happening in HR at the moment, where, an older school model typically spoke about the fact that, HR, you've got limited time, you've got limited resources, focus it on leaders because that will be the biggest impact that you can make within the organization, and it would cascade down through all the different levels. Now we're seeing at the moment with the rise of comments such as, employee or fields such as employee experience, rather, that there's this big thing around focusing on the human being in context and seeing them first as an employee and then secondary, regardless of where they fit into the traditional organizational ladder, there's a developmental need and developmental requirement, especially around internal mobility, talent being scarce. A lot of people are saying, but how better can we invest in our own talent to be able to grow them for the future? And for me, the biggest challenge I've had in my previous years as CHRO was by the time people get to that middle management layer, there's been so many bad behaviors that's been ingrained into the way that they lead or manage or work or approach things, that coaching becomes this reactive fixing exercise where your first couple of years as a leader, I'm almost uncoaching you to unlearn a lot of the behaviors. What are you doing differently? Because I think there's a huge opportunity here, but how do you scale coaching?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would just add something to a comment that you made earlier, if I might, which is, see them as employee first, and then somebody that needs development second. I would add a precursor to that, if I might, which is I think you need to see them as a human being first, then an employee, then a means to production, or whatever phrase would follow it, and that's really, really important. And I think it's exactly where you just hinted we're heading, which is music to my ears particularly, which is that we're seeing the rise and the importance of individualization, and I think that's a really, really good thing. And actually, of course, coaching is almost the ultimate individualized approach to development, because done well, you're going to meet people where they are, you're going to work with them on what they have prioritized in terms of their developmental need, as long as that's broadly matched with what the organization wants. And so I think that's one shift that I would just suggest has been really important. And the organizations are beginning to get that, as you said, that employee value proposition, the employee experience really raised in profile. Then you've got to look at where might coaching sort of be useful to help the organization get to where it needs to get to. And exec coaching is still great, by the way. It's still really, really important. But this isn't either or. This is what could we do in addition to? And if you want to improve this is not just me saying this is the research would suggest that if you want to land a transformation program, I'm not particularly talking about digital transformation, but I'm talking about cultural change. It might be that you're off the back of a merger and acquisition. You're looking at a big culture change program, maybe. How do you embed that? And how do you support the people who are actually made accountable for landing it? And typically that is that middle manager group. And in the past, you would recognize this, I'm sure, from your own background. Typically, we'd have sheep dipped them through a cookie cutter program. I've mixed my metaphors there, sheep dipping and cookie cutter. But we'd have got 400 people in a room. They'd have all heard the same message. And the following day, we'd had another 400 people in, and we'd have given them the same message and expected that was enough. The beauty of coaching is that it can help individuals make the changes that they need to make. But the problem is, people like myself, there aren't enough people to go around an organization that might need many hundreds of people trained. And also, let's be perfectly frank, it's way too expensive, both in terms of time and finances, to try and coach people using an exec coach model, right? So what's happened over time is there are several players in the marketplace who have looked at what I'm now calling coaching as a service. There you go. That's a first. Maybe that's not been heard until this very podcast. But I was trying to think about, organizations like Hello Ezra and Coach Hub and our own version, which is Concise Coaching, looking at how do we solve the problem of scaling coaching to as many people as possible in order that the organization has the best chance possible of delivering at scale, the thing that requires a large number of people to deliver it. And culture change transformation is one of those. So that's the motivation for it. And I think there are many ways, in an increasing number of ways, of how organizations are resolving that. And for us, we have a 20-minute methodology that's proprietary to us. And, we've proven produces change, both transactional change, I need help getting from A to B, but also transformational change. I feel like a different person having had these 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 sessions. And I'm, for example, just a single example, a much more confident leader than I was before I started having these conversations. So it's a very dynamic marketplace at the minute. And I think I'm going to be really transparent, and I hope you don't mind, but it's a big business opportunity. There's a big market there if you can nail it. So I'm not pretending to be sort of holier than thou. And it's also driven, but certainly is for us, it's driven by helping organizations ensure that those transformation programs have a much better chance of landing.
I think there's also, Glenn, to build on that. Firstly, I definitely agree. There's time for an and model. It's not an or model. I think, the traditional exec coaching, the 90-minute session or whatever you do, I think there's a lot of value for that, because I think the context is different and the complexity is different of what you are dealing with. Where I also believe there is a huge opportunity is being able to give accessibility to other people within the organization. And I think it does require a bit of a paradigm shift from a coaching point of view around what does a valuable session look like and what does a valuable process look like. Because I think a lot of the colleagues I speak to that are in the coaching space still kind of hold to that point around to say, I engage in 6 sessions, and then after 7 months, we will have a realistic view where the real change has taken place. And I think the world is slightly different at the moment, where it might not require in-depth detail, psychological coaching, but I find that people at the moment are requiring a sounding board. They're requiring a different perspective. They want somewhere where somebody independent that they can voice to say, I'm going through this. How do I approach that? What are you seeing in terms of my own behavior? And I think that that is different. And I think there is a real call for us to redefine that value proposition for the scalable coaching solution lower down within the organization. I think digital has made it extremely accessible. Doesn't have to be digital. It could also be, kind of in person and in face. I think we shouldn't get stuck on channel of where and how it takes place, but rather what the purpose is that sits behind, the 20-minute conversation that I can schedule over a period of time for me to be able to check in. Something I want to check with you, Glenn, because I have and I'm now sticking my neck out here. I've got a bit of a theory that I think we will see unfold in the next couple of years, where during the pandemic, they spoke about the prematurely promoted, where talent didn't want to move around. A lot of people were put into leadership positions, not necessarily quite being ready for that. They might have had the technical skill, and it was a time of crisis. People did great. They really, really stepped up. They did some excellent work as young and new leaders. But I don't think their emotional maturity around what it takes to lead in a sustainable way has quite caught up with a lot of those people. I'd love your thoughts, because I think it ties into this point that you are making, that coaching has to be lower down in the organization and a lot more accessible. As an HR practitioner, how do I utilize what you do and others do in that space to guide this new group of, can I call them prematurely promoted leaders that, have all the technical skills, but they are bumping their heads around the stuff that nobody teaches you, the boardroom dynamics, getting stakeholders on board. I don't think they need training. Is there anything else we can do?
It's interesting. They might need some training, actually, and that's coming from a coach. I think there are modern ways that you can access training, right? Whereas back in the day, it might be you sit in a classroom for 2 days every couple of months. Go onto many of the learning platforms that there are and read some stuff. Go onto YouTube and find a reliable source. Listen to podcasts. I can't think of any particularly, but there are so many resources, and actually younger leaders are much more comfortable using that as their source of learning in many ways than people with grey hair like mine. So I think there's definitely a learning component that might be looked at, and there are plenty of ways to resolve that in an engaging way. Coaching one-to-one typically doesn't have an agenda or a curriculum behind it. So it's rarer, not unheard of course, but rarer that you'll have a curriculum that you are coaching to. But what you tend to find is that coaching is very good at supporting a leadership program. So last year we supported a leadership program at one of the world's foremost universities based in London. And they were going through a leadership program, and the organization decided that the best way to help embed that and then sort of make practical the theoretical learning was to support it with coaching. And that had a really super set of outcomes. And it's not an original way of working, by the way. Lots of people will support in a hybrid learning kind of way, that kind of approach. So I think you can definitely augment learning with coaching to embed that and make it practical. The other thing that we're calling sort of leadership development 3.0 is group coaching, which is a really innovative way of actually having some element of curriculum and some element of peer coaching, so that not only can somebody bring a challenge to that environment in a safe environment with peers, but they also get coached by their peer, facilitated by an external coach, but they get coached by their peer, and as a byproduct actually learn how to coach too. So then you've got that kind of leader as coach model being sort of almost done through a process of osmosis, or learned through a process of osmosis. So I think there are lots of creative ways that organizations might think about learning, accessing learning in modern ways, and then supporting the embedding and the actioning of the learning by using some coaching. I don't know if does that answer your question?
No, definitely. I mean, there's a methodology that we use at AIHR, which is, tell, show, do, apply. And then, I also believe that there's a reflect component to it as part of that development journey. And I think you've definitely mentioned that. And I find something that's, I think, really exciting to see is that people are pulling a lot of these resources in a personalized way, as you've mentioned. Now, whether those resources are pertaining to well-being, pertaining to leadership, pertaining to where I need to go, it does tell us that there is a hunger and a need for people to say, but what is it? How do I best equip myself as part of, that particular journey? I think the second thing that you're mentioning is that I think is so important for HR professionals to understand is to break through the mold of what they think traditional coaching was. And I think to be able to move into the space to say, but let's start, like you've mentioned earlier, if this is the human being or the group of human beings that we want to look at, what does their entire developmental experience look like? And how does, coaching then complement the learning component? How does it complement the experiential component? How does it complement the transferable skills that they need to get to almost grow into that leader as coach type of model, if that's a chosen model within the organization? And I think it does start by changing a bit of the mindset and the paradigm around what people believe coaching is and where it fits within the organization.
Can I just chip in there with an observation that's maybe a bit counterintuitive, but I think the coaching industry has done itself no favors at all in terms of how it markets itself to people that might be interested in it because it's going to solve some of the problems that they've got inside an organization. I think it's done a terrible job, frankly. And you have a very confused marketplace with every person under the sun putting coach after their name, whether they're a voice coach, a dog trainer coach. It's pretty much put coach after it or before it, and you're kind of good to go. It's really confused, and I think it comes back in part to our earlier comment about what is coaching. I think the thing for buyers, and I hope this is helpful, is if you're trying to make a decision about coaching, what coaching is, it's less important that your suppliers that you're looking at have a single version of it. It's the fact they've got a version, they've got a definition for themselves, they own a definition, and then they operate around that definition of coaching. Is it clear? Is it clear to you? And then does everything that they do sort of back that up? And I think that's probably something that we could do much better. So I'll take one for the team there.
I think however, it is a valuable point to make, Glenn, because I do think that, and it's the same way with any science. I'm not picking on coaching particularly, but I think there is this notion that if people can't define it and they can't understand it, then they make a lot of assumptions about what it is, and then those assumptions are either confirmed or dispelled by the experience that they have if they choose to engage. I think over the years, coaching was too much of a blanket term for a whole lot of things that people kind of looked into. And again, the point I made earlier and something, that you've also mentioned is around this. And when I say evidence-based approach towards coaching, I don't want people to misinterpret. I don't mean you send out a survey and then you coach according to the results. What I mean is there an actual body of knowledge that sits behind the approach that the individuals are taking? Can they express it? And is this something that does fit with your particular organization? So I had some advice that asks that question to say, whenever you're chatting to, call it a coaching provider, is ask the question to say, what do they believe is coaching? From what perspective are they approaching coaching, and how do they believe that aligns with where the client is at the moment?
Yeah, and something you said earlier just resonated for me as you were saying that, Dieter, which is, to some extent, coaching is the methodology. I'm more interested in what are the impacts that you say your versions of coaching can deliver. So if I'm an HR professional and I know that I need to deliver this, is coaching, or is what you're offering as coaching, likely to deliver those sets of outcomes? And if it's not, go look for something else, or go look for another provider that has a different version of coaching and says that that's the thing that they can deliver. I think the danger is if you look for coaching, you'll get lost. If you look for embedding transformation as a single example, or developing a high-performing team, by outcome, you should be drawn, one would like to think, more towards people that have got that as their set of outcome. It's just too complicated, it's too confused a market, I think, if you start with coaching.
I agree. And I also think, I think there's something that a lot of HR professionals listening today also needs to take into account, that unfortunately, I think with that confusion in the market, coaching was seen as a reactive, let me fix something that is not quite working. Whereas I do believe that it adds almost most of its value. And I'm a firm believer in positive psychology, so I just need to state that as well. When it's built as part of an enabling process and an enhancing process, and it's done proactively to prepare people also for what is to come. Obviously, it's not always possible to do it that way, but I do think organizations need to start shifting their mindset. It was interesting for me this week to read what was discussed at Davos, last week around what the priorities are. And a lot of those things on the responsibilities that's going to sit on leaders' shoulders is around this fact to say, but how do we think broader than our own context? How do we think wider than only what's happening today in the short term? And how can we actually think about longer term change? But that starts for me with more of a proactive approach around helping people understand how best to leverage, whether you believe in strengths or whether you believe in abilities, how best to leverage that, as part of my own developmental journey. Glenn, for those listening, what pitfalls do I need to avoid? Let's talk about, we're engaging in a coaching process. Just, some advice that you can give to HR professionals that want to engage with a coach or want to engage with a developmental journey where coaching forms part of that. What are some of the things to look out for?
I was thinking long and hard about this because you were kind enough to send me some questions sort of ahead of time, most of which, by the way, you've not asked at all. So that was great. So I'm joking. But this was an interesting one because you could go really, really sort of tactical. But I wanted to sort of stay what I hope is at a kind of helpful level for HR professionals that will be listening. I think the first is something I'm not apologising for repeating, and that is be really clear on what impacts you are looking to deliver or achieve. That's so important. We still have way too many conversations with buyers of coaching who are interested in it because they've heard good things about it. And by the time you're halfway through the conversation, you're thinking this is not a coaching, or certainly not our version of coaching as a that person needs a mentor or something else. So I think that clarity, Dieter, is absolutely critical because in many ways you can discount coaching really quickly if it's not the right solution. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second is think about how, particularly if you're there's some internal sales that you need to do to sort of land this as an idea, think about how coaching reinforces the culture. So, we know that organizations are valued on many, many factors that will end up with giving you a multiple of the value for the organization. And culture is one of them. So the strength of the culture, the clarity of the culture, the way that the employees feel about the culture, is a multiplier in terms of the value of the business. So it has a strategic value to get it right. What's coaching's role, or how does it fit? Or how does it reinforce or augment your culture? If you're going for a person-centric kind of culture approach, how's coaching going to work for that? Typically, by the way, very, very well, of course, because the individual's key. High-performance culture, how's it going to work if that's the culture that you're driving to? Again, with some coaches and coaches that take a particular approach really well. Others, not so worried, maybe more on the developmental side of coaching, perhaps not so much, also strongly impacted by that. But I think the culture thing's the second one. So we've got this idea of clarity of impact, connection or fit to your culture. And the third thing I would say is, please spend a little bit of time preparing the ground so that those that are going to be receiving coaching understand at least a little bit about what that experience is going to be like. What is it going to be? What is it definitely not going to be? So that when you come to coaching, what you're not saying is, I need some tips on, because that's, and I know you're, no. I know you're laughing, but it happens way too often, and that's not a criticism of busy HR professionals, but it's about systematizing, the onboarding, so that people come clear on what it's going to be like, ready and prepared, and then they can get the most out of that experience. So I would say for me, those are the three big ones.
I love that, Glenn. I think it's I'm smiling at your last point because it's similar, the world I come from in terms of organizational development, where, very often you'll engage in a process with, a client or with a division, and your first almost 3 engagements is just about clearing ground in terms of the basic understanding of what are we here to do and what does that look like and who's supposed to be doing what in order to get there. So I love the idea of, the clarity. I do want to touch a little bit on the connection to culture, because I think that's such an important point that a lot of people underestimate. And I find, whether it's through coaching or whether it's through other developmental processes, if you don't bear culture as a context in mind, I think you run into, and can I call it behavioral conflict, where what you're trying to develop within a leader is not reinforced by the environment or celebrated in the environment, or to a large extent sometimes it's just tolerated in the environment. And I think that's a real risk for people if they don't take that into account. If you work in a particular scale up, high performance, cutthroat business, given the market that you are in, a culture looks very different than what you look like in terms of a bigger organization, settled industry, playing in the longer term. And I think people need to understand that a little bit more and bring that context into the room. Don't know if you've got some further thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there are shades of coaching that will probably fit most cultures, not all. And I think that comes back to this point of you being clear on what your culture is and what you want to reinforce as part of that, and finding a way that coaching is being done that augments that. The point you made about understanding what your culture is, so that you then go, actually, is coaching, do I need to do more prep because coaching is going to be so? And by the way, I've got a quick anecdote, if I might. It's a slightly old one, but one of the largest greengrocers or food stores in the UK, I'll keep it as broad as that, had us in a while back to do Leader as Coach program. And we were going through the program 2 or 3 days. It was absolutely great. People loved it. And then we went to visit them in their outlying sort of warehouses and things. And I rocked up to this particular place, and this guy said to me, I said, how did you find the coaching? He said, I'm really cross. And I'm thinking, no, that's not good, is it? And of course, and I said, oh, okay, so classic coaching, if you've asked the question, you've got to be prepared for the response. And so I said, oh, that's why was that? He said, nobody's ever told me I could lead in that way. And I said, what do you mean? He said, there's this way of leading here, and if you don't lead like that, you're kind of out. And if you can't drive results using that sort of style, you're out. Now, this is quite an old example, but it's still truer than you'd like to think, right? And I said, so what do you mean? He said, well, coaching is a much more joint effort. As a leader, using coaching style is a much more kind of joint effort. It's more collaborative, working together. And he said, and the tone in my team's completely changed. He said, but I had to prepare them for me being different. He said, and I spent the first bit, like you were just saying about the first 3 sessions in an OD or a psych session, had to clear the ground from everything that had passed because they were so imbued in that kind of approach to things. Really funny, really sort of just don't ask the question unless you're ready for the answer.
But I love that though, Glenn, because it points towards something that I'm seeing a lot in the client engagements that I have is the definition of what good looks like from a leadership point of view is significantly changing. And what I'm hoping will happen over the next couple of years, because we don't need another model and we don't need another theory. I think we need a lot more grace around leaders finding the best way that they will lead in the context that they find themselves. I'm not talking about situational leadership. I'm talking more about that personal journey of being able to uncover the journey of what the privilege of leadership would look like for you and how you can apply that here. Because I think for too long, and it's very interesting for me at the moment to see, with some global leadership changes, to make it practical, with Jacinda Ardern also just moving out of her position, the conversation opening up again around, empathetic leadership and what that looks like. And is that the way forward? I think that's one style that could work. I don't think it works in all environments, but I think it is a lot more around understanding how am I going to lead and how do I step up as a particular leader. And I think coaching is a really great conversation to be able to get us there. Glenn, I want to, before we start wrapping up, I want to look towards the future a bit more. And I want to ask you the question, I think you've really given us some really good insight in terms of where coaching has come from and where coaching is now and what some of the things are that we are dealing with. Let's fast forward a couple of years into the future, to 2030, 2035. What is the role of the coach and what do you think coaching in general looks like?
Well, I have both a hope and sort of an expectation maybe. Back in 2016, 17, I created with a colleague of mine the world's first voice-enabled coaching app. So actually, unlike Alexa or Siri that you ask them questions and they give you answers, actually Integra, which is our coaching app, actually asks you the questions. So you are walked through an app by an app, right? A coaching conversation. We've done some really interesting research with University of Stellenbosch to look at the impacts of that, and actually it's really positive. There are text bots that you can do coaching through. You can certainly do some psychological kind of work in that space too. I think Stanford produced an app terribly named Woebot, which was for kids with anxiety. WOE. I'm thinking I think your marketing department might have done some work there. But I do think, with artificial sort of generalized intelligence. So this idea of a constantly learning AI, that by 2035 we'll be much closer to really sophisticated conversational bots of one description or another that will be doing, and I make myself really unpopular in the coaching space, probably at least as good coaching as a human being. And ultimately, I genuinely think that if you think of all the pieces of information, a technology can absorb and interpret and then, respond with or from, I've got a feeling that they might be better than a human ultimately, just because even as a human being, you can't possibly pull in all the information that a digital platform could. So if you think about something as simple as your wearable, for example, sentiment analysis, face recognition, all of those things. Now that for some will cause, an absolute sort of horrified response. And I get it. I think the key for me is, are coaches helping lead? Let's say it's inevitable. I don't know that it is, but let's say it's inevitable. Are coaches leading what that should look like and could look like? Or are we leaving it to technicians who see it as a business opportunity and might have done a weekend course on how to ask some questions?
Glenn, I can't agree with you more, because something that worries me a bit in this space at the moment is, and it's broader than coaching, it's more in the people science space, is I think we are not involved enough, and maybe we're not skilled enough, maybe we're not credible enough to guide the development of a lot of these technological advances. To use a very practical example, recently with ChatGPT having exploded in the market, I think there's been so many conversations around, is this the end of transactional HR? Should we replace business partnering with, a bot that can actually answer that in a very real conversational way? But I think the conversation is a bit broader around, how do you augment what we offer, but how do you view it from, and I'm going to call it the consumer's perspective, to say that there's something that needs to happen, what's the impact that this needs to have? And I believe that different parts will play different roles. But to be able to do that, we have to make sure that the models that underpin a lot of the advances in technology is built in an ethical way. It does the right things. It guides people in the right way. It has the right points of interaction. And I think that body of research is slowly but surely coming to the fore. I know of another study that I think that proved in the first 3 sessions that you have in general with either a coach or somebody with a psychological background, the machine tends to kind of be a little bit better initially, because it is about the combination of facts. It's a combination of where things have come from and learning to engage. But there are some, more complex situations where a human being intervention is quite important beyond those first couple of conversations. But I think it's such an exciting space to be in, and if we as people practitioners and as HR, we should rather embrace that and help guide where it is going to go, as opposed to, I think, almost in a large extent, face it with a bit of fear around it's taking part of our identity away. And I think that's going to be a great conversation over the next couple of years if we are open enough to be able to participate in that. So I'm with you in terms of that as well. Glenn, from my side, as we're nearing towards the end, a couple of key takeaways that I think was really valuable in terms of the insights that you shared with us. And for me, the first thing is around having clarity of why coaching is the answer and what coaching needs to achieve in the context of the impact that you want to create within the organization. I think the second point, that coaching is about movement and it's about change, but it's also about context and making sure that you are able to meet people within that particular context. Love the fact that you spoke about that we need to move away from the old industrialized model of coaching. Coaching will show up differently in different places, and we need to adapt our models and our thinking around making coaching accessible to a lot more people a lot more of the time, if coaching is going to have a real impact within the organization. Definitely love the fact to say that if you get started as an HR practitioner in the coaching world, when engaging with a vendor, ask them, Where are they coming from? What is their view? What is their approach on these things to evaluate whether they are able to coach with clarity and to coach in the culture that you have, as well as then on the other side, go and prepare the ground for driving the change within the organization that you would like to see. Glenn, from my side, a very, very big thank you. Thank you for joining us on the HR Dialogues podcast. Sounds like you are doing really, really exceptional work, and all the best to you and the rest of the team.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been, as always, with the conversations that you and I have, really, really enjoyed it. So thanks very much for inviting me.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Glenn.